In the spring of 1889, the richest men in America owned a lake in the mountains of Pennsylvania. They had bought an old dam to hold it, and they had spent years quietly making that dam weaker. 14 miles below them, in the valley, lived 20,000 people who had no idea the lake was there at all. On the last afternoon of May, after the heaviest rain the region had ever recorded, the dam let go. What came down the valley was not a flood in any ordinary sense. It was a wall of water 60 feet high, moving at the speed of a train, and it reached the city of Johnstown in 57 minutes. More than 2,000 people died. A third of them were never identified. And when it was over, the men who owned the lake were asked in a court of law whether they were to blame. This is the anatomy of the Johnstown flood, and of the question no one would answer. Johnstown sat where two rivers met, in a narrow, steep-walled valley in western Pennsylvania. It was a hard, prosperous place, built on iron and steel. The Cambria Iron Works was one of the largest steel producers in the country, and the town had grown up tight around it. By 1889, some 20,000 people lived in Johnstown, and the boroughs strung along the river above it. Immigrant families, mill workers, shopkeepers. The valley was so narrow that the town had been built partly by narrowing the river itself, pinching its channel to make room for streets. In the mornings, the mill whistles set the rhythm of the day. Slovak, Welsh, German, and Irish families packed the narrow streets around the works, 3 and 4 to a house, with church steeples above the rooftops and children everywhere. It was the kind of tight, ordinary, striving town where everyone lived a few doors from everyone else. That closeness is part of why the flood was so complete. When the water came, it did not take scattered strangers. It took whole streets, whole congregations, whole families together. That detail matters. A river squeezed into a smaller channel has nowhere to go when it rises. The people of Johnstown already knew their streets could flood in a hard spring. They had learned to live with water in the cellar. They had not learned to imagine a lake falling on them from the sky. 14 miles up the valley, above the little town of South Fork, stood the reason. The South Fork Dam. It was not new, and it had not been built for a resort. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had raised it beginning in 1838 as part of a canal system, a great public work meant to carry boats across the mountains. When it was finished, it was one of the largest earth dams in the world, some 70 feet high, more than 900 feet long, a wall of packed clay and rock holding back a reservoir that fed the canal in dry months. The men who built it understood what a dam of that size demanded. It had a spillway cut into the rock at one end to carry off floodwater, and it had a set of iron discharge pipes at its base with valves so that operators could open them and let the lake down slowly and deliberately whenever the water climbed too high. Those pipes were the dam's safety mechanism. They were the way you controlled the lake. Then the railroads came, and the canals died. The great public work was abandoned. The state sold the dam to the Pennsylvania Railroad, which had no use for it either, and it passed from hand to hand, half forgotten, its reservoir slowly draining through a break in its face. For years, the South Fork Dam was simply an old ruin in the hills. Until, in 1879, it was bought by men who wanted the lake back. They were among the wealthiest industrialists in America, Pittsburgh steel and coke and railroad money. The organizer was a coke and steel man named Benjamin Ruff, and the membership would come to include Henry Clay Frick, the coke king, and men in the orbit of Andrew Carnegie himself. 50 of them, eventually. They called themselves the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. What they wanted was a private paradise. A mountain lake, stocked with game fish, ringed with cottages and a clubhouse, where the most powerful families in the country could sail and fish for a few weeks each summer, far from the smoke of the mills that made their fortunes. To have their lake, they had to repair the old dam and close the break in its face. And here the story turns. Because the club did not restore the South Fork Dam. The club, to save money and to suit its own comfort, made it weaker, one decision at a time. It is worth holding the two worlds side by side. Below, in the valley, thousands of families breathed coal smoke 12 hours a day to make the steel. Above, on the lake those same industries paid for, the owners sailed small boats on clean mountain water and complained when the fishing was poor. The dam was the seam between those two worlds, and the people who lived below it had no vote in how it was kept, no say, and for the most part, no knowledge of how thin that seam had been allowed to be. First, they wanted a road across the top of the dam, wide enough for 2 carriages to pass. So they lowered the crest of the dam by several feet and spread the fill to widen it. Lowering a dam does one thing above all others. It lowers the margin, the distance between the top of the water and the top of the wall. It brings the day the lake spills over that much closer. Second, they wanted to keep their expensive stocked fish from escaping down the spillway, so they laid iron fish screens across the mouth of the spillway, the one channel designed to carry off a flood. Screens catch fish. They also catch branches and logs and everything a swollen river tears loose. In a storm, the spillway would clog. And third, the part that is hardest to forgive. The old iron discharge pipes at the base of the dam, the valves that let an operator lower the lake in an emergency, were gone before the club even took over, sold off for scrap by an earlier owner. The club knew this, and the club never replaced them. Think about what that meant. A dam is a thing that holds back water until you decide to let some out. The club had built a lake with no drain. There was no valve to open, no pipe to pull. If the water rose, there was nothing anyone could do but watch it and pray it did not reach the top. And there is a reason engineers fear an overtopped earth dam above all things. A concrete dam can sometimes take water over its top and survive. An earth dam cannot. The moment water pours over the crest and down the outer face, it carves the dam away from behind, eating into the very material that holds the lake. Every safeguard the club had removed, the height, the spillway, the drain, existed to make sure water never reached the top. They had dismantled the only thing standing between the lake and the valley. There was more. Repairs to the old break had been done cheaply, with mud and straw and whatever was on hand, leaving the rebuilt center of the dam lower than its ends, a shallow sag exactly where the water would rise highest. Engineers who saw it worried. One, Daniel Morell of the Cambria Ironworks, sent his own man to inspect it, warned the club in writing, and even offered to help pay for proper repairs. The club declined. So the trap was set years before it sprang. A lowered wall, a blocked spillway, no drain, a sag in the middle. And below it, a valley of 20,000 people who were told again and again that the lake in the mountains was perfectly safe. The people below were not entirely ignorant. They knew there was a dam, and a club, and a lake. Every so often, in a wet spring, word would come down the valley that the dam might go, and people would glance up at the hills, and nothing would happen. The water always held. The warnings always proved false. And so a kind of grim joke took hold in Johnstown. When the rains came, someone would say the lake was coming down again, and someone else would laugh. The dam that cried wolf. It is one of the cruelest facts of the whole story. The very thing that should have saved them, the warnings, had been worn smooth by years of being wrong. But the warnings had not been wrong because the dam was safe. They had been wrong because the dam had not yet been tested by a storm large enough. In the last week of May, 1889, that storm was on its way. The rain began on the 30th of May and did not stop. A great low-pressure system had crossed the plains and settled over the mountains, and it poured down 6 to 10 inches of water in a single day, the heaviest rainfall ever recorded in that part of the country. Creeks became rivers, rivers left their banks, and high in the hills, Lake Conemaugh began to rise. At dawn on the 31st, the club's president, Elias Unger, looked out at the lake from his cottage and saw something that stopped him. The water was near the top of the dam, and still climbing. He called out every man he could find. They did what they could, which was almost nothing. They tried to raise the top of the dam with earth, as fast as the rain washed it away. They tried to clear the fish screens, now packed solid with debris, choking the spillway. A young engineer named John Park rode down to South Fork and had warnings telegraphed down the valley. Not once, but twice. The warnings went out, and down in the valley they were not believed. The telegraph messages reached South Fork and Johnstown, and there they mostly stopped. Some were never passed along, others were heard and shrugged off. The lake was coming down again, the dam that cried wolf. People went about their Friday, in the rain, with water already rising in their streets from the ordinary flood. It is worth being precise about this because it is where the blame is often misplaced. The warnings were ignored because of the false alarms, but the false alarms existed because the dam had always been precarious. The complacency was not the cause of the disaster, it was another symptom of it. A little before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the water reached the top of the sagging center of the dam and began to pour over it. Once water flows over the top of an earth dam, the end is only minutes away. The overflow cuts a notch. The notch deepens. The notch becomes a gap. And then, between about 10 minutes to 3 and 5 minutes to 3, the South Fork Dam failed. Not slowly, the center gave way, and the gap opened, and the entire lake, 20 million tons of water, drove through it at once. For 30 to 60 minutes, the lake emptied itself into the valley. At its peak, the water came through the broken dam faster than the Mississippi River. A body of water 2 miles long and a mile wide simply stood up and began to walk downhill, and there was nothing in the valley that could stop it. What went down the valley was not clean water. Within seconds, it had torn the village of South Fork apart and swallowed the dam's own debris, and then it did what a wall of water does in a narrow valley. It scoured. It picked up trees, boulders, houses, barns, animals, people, railroad cars, and carried them all forward in a churning front that grew as it went. It ran the 14 miles to Johnstown in 57 minutes, but it did not run straight. The valley bent, and at every bend, the water climbed the walls and fell back and struck the next town square. Mineral Point, East Conemaugh, where it caught a railroad yard and threw locomotives like toys. Woodvale, a mill town of about 1,000 people, where it killed 1 in 3 and left almost nothing standing. Consider what 57 minutes meant on the ground. In East Conemaugh, the flood struck a railroad yard and threw 60-ton locomotives end over end. In Woodvale, a company town of about 1,100 people, the water killed roughly 1 person in 3, and swept the mills and the houses and the streets so clean that afterward you could not tell a town had ever stood there. Each of these places was someone's whole world, erased in the time it takes to boil a kettle, and all of it was still growing as it bore down on the city that would give the disaster its name. At the East Conemaugh rail yard, an engineer named John Hess heard the roar coming and did the bravest thing in the whole story. He tied down his locomotive's whistle and ran the engine backward toward the town, screaming a warning ahead of the water. Some people heard it and climbed and lived. It is the one place the warning arrived in time because a man carried it on the front of the flood itself. By the time the water left Woodvale, it was carrying the wreckage of 4 towns and the boilers of the Gautier Wire Works, and it was perhaps 60 feet high. Ahead of it, a mile away, unaware, lay Johnstown. The people of Johnstown heard it before they saw it. Survivors described a low rumble, then a roar, then a dark mist rising over the rooftops up the valley, and then the wall itself, a moving cliff of black water and debris, taller than the houses, coming down the main street. It took the town in a matter of minutes. Houses did not so much break as lift and turn and join the flood. Some carried whole with families still inside them. The water did not simply pass through. It filled the valley from wall to wall, and then, blocked at the lower end of the city, it swirled back on itself and struck a second time from the other direction. Thousands of people were in the water at once, clinging to roofs, to trees, to floating wreckage, dragged through a city that was dissolving around them. And nearly all of that wreckage, and nearly everyone still alive on it, was being carried toward one place: the Great Stone Bridge at the bottom of the town. The stone bridge carried the Pennsylvania Railroad across the river in a series of massive stone arches. It was one of the few structures in Johnstown strong enough to survive the flood, and that was the tragedy of it. Because it held, it became a dam of its own. The wreckage of an entire valley piled up against those arches. Timber, rail cars, whole houses, the bodies of the drowned, and, tangled through all of it, miles of barbed wire from the ruined wire works upstream. The pile grew until it covered 30 acres and stood 70 feet high, a solid mountain of debris, with hundreds of living people trapped inside it. And then the debris caught fire. No one is certain how. Oil from the wreckage, coal stoves, a spark. But the pile at the stone bridge began to burn, and it burned as the survivors trapped in the wire and timber could not free themselves. At least 80 people who had lived through the flood died in the fire on the water. It burned for 3 days. It is almost too much to hold in the mind. To survive the wave, to be alive in the wreckage, and then to burn. Of all the terrible facts of Johnstown, the fire at the stone bridge is the one the survivors could least bear to describe. When the water finally fell, and the fire finally died, the valley was unrecognizable. Where Johnstown had stood was a plain of mud and wreckage, and the counting began. The number, as best it could ever be fixed, was about 2,208. It was, at that time, the worst loss of life from a flood in the history of the United States. But a number that size hides the shape of the grief. 99 entire families were wiped out, every member, so that no one was left even to report them missing. 396 of the dead were children. And 777 people, a full third of the dead, were so disfigured or so far from anyone who knew them that they were never identified at all. The photographs from the days after are the hardest evidence of all, not because they are gruesome, but because they are so ordinary. A house lifted whole and set down in the middle of a street, unbroken, its curtains still in the windows, a great tree with the frame of a home speared clean through it. Survivors standing in the mud in their Sunday clothes because their Sunday clothes were all they had left. The camera recorded Johnstown more completely than any disaster before it, and those images went out across the country and made the loss impossible to look away from. The 777 unknown were buried together in a plot of plain white stones at Grandview Cemetery on the hill above the town. It is called the Plot of the Unknown, and it is one of the largest fields of unidentified dead in the country. Bodies from Johnstown were found for years afterward, some as far away as Cincinnati, 400 miles down the river system. Some were not found until 1911. For weeks, temporary morgues lined the valley and families walked the rows of the dead, looking for their own. Descriptions of the unidentified were posted on boards, a scrap of a dress, a wedding ring, a child's shoe, in the hope that someone would recognize a life from its smallest remaining detail. Many never found what they were looking for. The 777 unknown are, in a sense, still missing. Their families simply reached a day when they had to stop being able to look. And one name should be corrected here because it tells you how uncertain the counting was. For a century, the toll was given as 2,209. Then a historian found that a man listed among the dead, Leroy Temple, had in fact escaped the wreckage at the bridge, walked out of the valley, and simply never come back, for 11 years. One of the dead had been alive the whole time, so the number is 2,208, as close as we will ever come. The news went out on the telegraph within hours, and the response was unlike anything the country had seen. Johnstown became the first great national disaster of the modern age, the first to be photographed at scale, reported everywhere, and answered by a nation of strangers. Money came in from every state and from 18 foreign countries, from Russia and France and Germany and Britain and the Ottoman Empire, more than $3.5 million, an enormous sum for the time. Trains of food, clothing, and lumber began arriving within 2 days, because the Pennsylvania Railroad rebuilt its shattered line almost at once. The relief was as physical as the flood had been. The very first message out of the valley did not ask for food. It asked for coffins and for undertakers, and both came by the trainload. A demolition man known as Dynamite Bill Flynn brought a crew of 900 to blast the wreckage away from the stone bridge. The railroad flung a temporary wooden bridge across the gorge in 7 days and 7 nights. For months, the valley was one enormous work camp, 7,000 men at its peak, pulling a city back up out of the mud. And on the 5th of June, 5 days after the flood, a woman of 67 arrived by train and took charge of the relief. Her name was Clara Barton, and the organization she led, the American Red Cross, was only 8 years old and had never faced a disaster like this. Johnstown was its first great test. Barton stayed in Johnstown for more than 5 months. She and some 50 volunteers built warehouses and shelters, organized the distribution of aid, and put a kind of order back into a place that had lost everything. It was the moment the American Red Cross became what it is. Out of the worst day in the valley's history came the institution that would answer the country's disasters for the next century. And then, slowly, as the mud dried, the valley began to ask the question that had been waiting under all of it. Whose fault was this? The answer seemed obvious. A private club of the richest men in America had bought a great dam, lowered it, screened its spillway, and left it with no way to release the water, against written warnings, and the dam had failed and killed more than 2,000 people. Survivors and the families of the dead brought suit against the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. They lost. Every one of them. Not a single member of the club was ever held legally responsible for a single death. The club's defense was that the flood had been an act of God, an extraordinary storm no one could have foreseen, and that the dam would have failed no matter what. It was argued by a Pittsburgh law firm, Knox and Reed, whose 2 partners happened to be members of the club themselves. The men who broke the dam were defended by the men who owned it, and the courts of 1889 let it stand. Under the law as it then was, the club's structure shielded its members' personal fortunes, and it was nearly impossible to prove that any single wealthy owner had personally caused the break. The wealth that built the lake also built the wall around the blame. As one furious poem of the time put it, listing all the horrors that hell could wish, such was the price that was paid for faith. There is a coda to the injustice, and it matters. Because the outcome at Johnstown was so plainly wrong, so offensive to any ordinary sense of fairness, it did not simply pass. It became one of the pressures that slowly changed American law. In the years after Johnstown, American courts began to reach for an older idea from English law. That a person who gathers a dangerous thing on his land, a great mass of water above a valley, can be held liable when it escapes and does harm, whether or not you can prove he was careless. It is the beginning of what we now call strict liability. The principle that if you build the lake, you answer for the flood. The engineer's report on the dam, the official investigation, reached a careful, comfortable conclusion that the disaster was essentially an act of nature. It was sealed for nearly 2 years by men who did not want to be drawn into the lawsuits, and it was quietly wrong. More than a century later, a modern hydraulic analysis went back to the numbers and found what the valley had always believed. The club's changes had cut the dam's safe capacity in half. The flood was not an act of God, it was an act of neglect. That is the thread that runs from Johnstown to almost every disaster since. A danger is created for private benefit. Its upkeep is quietly deferred to save money. The people who profit are somewhere else, insulated by distance and by law from the people who carry the risk. And when the thing finally fails, the loss lands entirely on the powerless, while the powerful reach for the oldest defense there is that no one could possibly have known. Johnstown is remembered not only for how many it killed, but for how clearly it showed that machinery working, and for the long, slow effort afterward to make sure that the men who build the lake can no longer simply walk away from the flood. Johnstown rebuilt. It flooded again, in 1936 and again in 1977, because a narrow valley on 2 rivers will always be a dangerous place to build a city. But the flood of 1889 was different in kind. It did not come from the sky or the rivers. It came from a lake that a handful of men had chosen to hold above a valley, in a dam they had chosen not to fix. The lake is gone now. The dam was never rebuilt. Where Lake Conemaugh once stood there is only a green valley and the two stone ends of the dam standing apart with the sky where the water used to be. It is a quiet place. You would never know, standing in the gap, that everything below it once depended on the judgment of men who were somewhere else, and thought the danger was someone else's to worry about. If the forgotten deserve a witness, and the pattern deserves to be remembered, subscribe. The next inquiry is already open.